The Sufis of Today by Syed F. Hussein. Summary. The increase in information about the Sufis and their knowledge encourages cranks and shallow students, as well as providing valuable materials for genuine study. There are a very large number of imaginative emotionalists, as well as numerous arid and over-intellectual scholars with prestige, but without Sufic insight. Many of the former stampede for fragmentary information because it appeals to them. They fail to appreciate that Sufic study must be comprehensive and directed from its authoritative source, otherwise it is next to useless. The latter tend to concentrate upon fossil materials, unaware of the living element. The longing for experience in religion among people, for instance of a Christian background, is at the root of a search for excitement, which is confused with spirituality because of a lack of the necessary distinction between these two important factors in most Western cultures, as well as in other parts of the world. The random adoption of selective parts of Sufi operation in the West is like a mirror image of the miming of Western technology among cargo cultists in scientifically underdeveloped communities familiar to Western anthropologists. Because this somewhat shallow reaction occurs in what are otherwise developed societies, observers on the whole fail to analyze it correctly. They believe that such a mentality cannot exist in modern societies. One major problem in the West until recently has been the absence of a single authoritative center of Sufi studies. In the East, by contrast, both the legitimate teachers and the imitators have been discernible for centuries. As a consequence in the West, and in parts of the East where the tradition is no longer operative, anyone can imagine himself or herself to be carrying on Sufi learning without effective supervision. Imitation and self-imagined Sufis are characterized by 1. An oversimplification of ideas and a narrow attitude towards literature, standardization of exercises and studies. 2. Imitation of names, formulae, words and costumes, ritualism, absence of safeguards against conditioning. 3. Loss of the understanding that literature, organizations, and other frameworks are instrumental and from time to time superseded, consequent adherence to externals and the ready adoption of fossil forms. 4. Lack of awareness of the uselessness of dilution and the mixing of specific curricula with extraneous ideas not indicated for that particular time, place, and community. 5. Inability to observe the difference between social groups and learning ones, in extreme cases leading to placing the group or individual above the objective. 6. Attention-seeking not diagnosed as such, mistaken for genuine interest. And 7. Difficulty in distinguishing the authentic Sufi enterprise from a false or imagined one. Advantages of the present position. In spite of the drawbacks which inevitably attend the general release of unfamiliar knowledge, much valuable work has been done by Idries Shah and others to introduce the concept and to maintain the form of the Sufi activity in thought and action best suited to the time, place, and people. Even on the relatively shallow plane of literary, psychological, and scientific affairs, these efforts have been widely appreciated. Although the cults have proliferated, the large and coherent contribution of the legitimate Sufi stream has grown to such proportions that the gap between the Sufis and their often unconscious imitators has grown satisfactorily wide. This has increasingly meant that even relatively inexpert observers have been more and more able to distinguish the difference between them, paralleling the traditional experience of the East, where this gap has ensured the viability of the authentic tradition while leaving the imitators to their amusements, for whatever use these may be to them. The contemporary existence of a central focus, the Society for Sufi Studies, means that competent work can continue for those who really want it. The Sufis of Today. It is nearly a decade and a half since Ted Hughes, writing in The Listener, described the Sufis as the biggest society of sensible men there has ever been on earth. Studying widely in what has been published on this subject during the period and the 100 years or so preceding it, these words appear as a watershed. Here is a major scholar writing in a literary magazine of the first importance, not an obscure quasi-religious journal. Here is a subject, in short, formerly to a great extent dealt with by cranks or frankly bemused academics. Even the Orientalist specialists have often said that Sufism confused them, brought into the mainstream of current thought in a major medium by a man with an immense audience. From this date onwards, an enormous interest in Sufi thought and action built up in the Western world, with some good and inevitably a few adverse consequences. Writer after writer since Hughes has stated how impossible it now is to look up the old, impoverished definitions of Sufism in reference works, a mystical system among Mohammedans characterized by ecstatic exercises, a revolt against the formalism of Islam, and so on, and give them any credence. What had actually happened, to the delight of some and to the dismay of a few entrenched interests, was that the last great ancient psychological system was starting to find its place in the arena of present interest. Hughes himself went so far as to indicate the directions which would be followed by later researchers in disinterring Sufism's role in history. Many forlorn puzzles in the world, which seemed to suggest that some great spiritual age somewhere in the Middle East had long since died and left indecipherable relics and automatisms to trouble our nostalgia, suddenly came into organic life. While this monumentous development was unfolding in Britain and the United States, I had been invited by Sheikh Imdad Hussein al-Qadiri, the Sufi historian, to travel through the Middle East, Central Asia, India and Pakistan. My brief was to consult the major Sufi authorities with a view to articulating our response to the avalanche of attention which we realized would soon descend upon us. There was no doubt that those diluted Sufic cults already operating in the West would receive a shot in the arm from the above-quoted and subsequent revelations. As a consequence, we would be meeting streams of seekers after truth, wishing to trace Sufism to its assumed local sources. We also knew that mimetic groupings, designed through error or downright imposture, would appear and would try to acquire involvement, what one respected but colloquially inclined American professor had already termed in print a piece of the action. We knew that the rigid requirements of the authentic Sufi voice would cause numbers of people to try to bypass the source of authoritative exposition, and that, unless we were careful, the superficial, though articulate, would produce one or more forms of quasi-Sufism tailored to Western tastes, but quite different from the real thing. A fresh wave of interest would surround the pedestrian and often inaccurate works of some traditionalist scholars who had written much on Sufism. They had hitherto, by default, often been taken as authorities, and would not willingly yield their position, however improper, since they naturally defended it like a property interest. And there was another likely consequence from the lid being taken off Sufi private history, as Ted Hughes' article elsewhere abundantly demonstrated. Among the scattered hypotheses of amateur mystics, theosophists, and dabblers in the occult, one often comes across references to the secret doctrine, some mysterious brotherhood that is said to hold the keys to everything in the West, outside Christianity, that touches the occult, All these things originated among the Sufis and represent degenerate, strayed filterings of the doctrine. Although quite obviously not intended as such, words like these could only cause further uncertainty to people who had been unprofitably connected with occult groupings, and they might run into the millions in the West alone, and cause perhaps sizable numbers of them to embark upon an attempted investigation of the Sufis. Nobody can prevent the quite laudable desire of men and women for knowledge, but people in the West who had no tradition of the kind of specifics that are the Sufi specialization, who lacked a certain kind of discipline or believed that it was not needed, who, on the other hand, would accept direction but only in a form or from a source that they themselves decided, all these were about to descend upon the purposeful and well-organized world of Sufi affairs. It would not be long either before tireless researchers, devouring such books on Sufism as were available, would find that they were full of references to esoteric Christianity. Indeed, many Sufis were in the past held to be secret Christians. In spite of Ted Hughes's disclaimer about outside Christianity, this time of doubt and rethinking in Christian circles would undoubtedly add to the flood of searchers, perhaps innumerable people seeking the real truth of Christianity. This could mean almost any number from a total of hundreds of millions of people in the Western world, and the consequent proliferation of Christian Sufi cults. I was chosen for my task by the Sufi Council because for almost 20 years, since 1945, I had specialized in investigating and assessing the potentiality of the so-called Sufi activities in the West, both experiential and academic. I was operating on the sociological level and not on one of direct, telepathic understanding, solely because we had been unable to make any psychic contact with such people in the 20th century West. To us, therefore, independent Sufi studies did not exist in Europe and America in our direct perception sense. There were only amateur attempts to deal with the material on an intellectual or emotional, not a spiritual and higher perceptive basis. At one end of the spectrum came the intensely cerebral theorizing of the academics and their derivatives. At the other, the circuses, with self-styled masters, funny clothes, and even funnier rituals. Some of the cults, it is true, had been kind enough to term themselves a revival of Sufi activity. But whereas it is possible to revive, say, a fashion, it is not possible to revive Sufi activity unless one knows who and what to revive, when and where and how. We had found no trace of this knowledge among these self-styled Sufis. Our prognostications as to the likely developments, hypertrophies, and misunderstandings of Sufism could have been based on prescience, but they did not need to be. Sufi experience in the past and anthropological investigations in the present indicated sufficiently clearly on the rational plane that all new or reintroduced activities undergo a deforming process in those circles which lack the basic knowledge and experience to prevent it. In the West, this deformation is well recognized, is termed cargo cultism, but is generally believed to be something which happens only in remote native cultures. Actually, it happens everywhere. It is the penalty of ignorance. Idries Shah has called it heroic ignorance, but ignorance it remains. Since we were faced with what was not a spiritual phenomenon in such expressions, but a social one, it was possible to deal with it only on the superficial level. Few things are more embarrassing, incidentally, than meeting leaders and members of Sufi groups who lack the elementary communications capacity which we regard as inseparable from senior membership of a school. It is like being a linguist and meeting people who are styled as interpreters, but who turn out not to be able to speak any second language at all. But because of the contemporary taboo against being descriptive in case it appears critical, this side of things is not generally made known beyond our circles. The result of our deliberations, carried on in India and Pakistan, in Afghanistan and Iran, Turkey and the Arab countries, was unequivocal. First, it was quite clear that in the West, the only forms of Sufism then well known were derivative or imitative ones. We have the same kind of thing in the East, but then we also have stable and authoritative Sufi establishments. The real Sufis, or at least their leaders, are well and widely known to the press, the universities, and other opinion leaders. The rest, some of them also being self-appointed Sufi experts, even in universities, are something of a tolerated joke. Some of the latter interact with their Western equivalents, but in general, worthwhile people keep away from them. They fill the demand for a slightly weird or over-intellectualized expression on the part of people who for some reason cannot enter into the real Sufi world. Our main problem was that the increasing links between the Eastern superficialists and their Western counterparts could become so strong and numerous that people in general might begin to confuse their activities with the genuine Sufi school. The bad, as Gresham's law has it, might drive out the good. The only way to make an easily communicated distinction between them and us was soon agreed. We decided to make known, for the benefit of the West and the Eastern imitators and counterparts, the fact that real Sufic activity was not narrow-based like the spurious ones, that it was characterized by the use of the widest variety of methods and formulations. Like all cults, of course, the inadequate and shallow so-called Sufi groupings relied, and still depend, upon oversimplification and a narrow range of theories and practices, mostly copied from books or derived from quite inauthentic teachers. They lack a living tradition in the true Sufi sense. In addition to assuming Eastern robes and names, some of these coteries employ merely one or two books, perhaps originally emanating from Sufi masters and intended for local use. Instead of seeing these as we do, and always have, as externals, they have often come to be regarded as a sort of perennial holy writ. Other groupings seek to link Sufism with one or two branches of metaphysics or ordinary religion, making a kind of interreligious mishmash which appeals to a wide range of people. Instead of getting to the root of things, they form a platform at a late stage of expression, the ritualistic. New cults tend to spring up and flourish or deteriorate, some of them more or less recognizable as derived from secondary Sufi materials and expressions, but generally only taking advantage of the current interest. Concurrently with our efforts to make known the truth about the ancient and also the contemporary facets of Sufism, we decided to encourage certain well-informed and competent Sufis to devote part of their time to the West, to monitor and represent the new developments which were to be expected there, of a healthier kind. From time to time, local Eastern authorities lectured, wrote and broadcast in the East and West, so that the traditional voice of Sufism should remain represented on the public level for those who really wanted it, rather than those who only sought emotional stimulus or circuses. Notably effective in this were the Sufi specialists Mahasini, Wasti, Yalman, Bokhari, Abbas, and Kadiri, who contributed widely on this theme. As time passed, of course, such was the interest in educational, literary, and psychological circles in the East and West that volumes of collected papers began to appear, which now constitute a major source of authoritative and reliable verification of the real Sufi effort. These are being published widely in the West. As predicted, of course, the cults and the confusions, the misunderstandings and the absurdities have indeed grown in the West. They have also influenced some people in the East. Fortunately, in neither case has the distortion reached anything like the proportions caused by a similar process and so lamented by parallel authorities in the field of Hindu and Buddhist interest. What is particularly interesting about all this is to note that, in spite of the legitimate Sufi guidance and many materials now being freely offered in the West, there is a powerful demand from the alleged students for the spurious and amateur, because the latter is more attractive to those who want circus and not knowledge. The real Sufis of today are to be discerned from their flexibility and the range of their interests, just as their forebears were. Before we further define the nature and action of real Sufis, there is the matter of those who oppose a clearer understanding of Sufi thought in its contemporary projection. Their motivation is almost always quite discernible. They include the second-rate and threatened academics suffering from a sour grapes syndrome already referred to, the various stultified cults which can neither learn nor collapse because of popular demand, sections of the sensationalist press which seek revelations, and not a negligible quantity, the rejected or disappointed who have tried to get into true Sufic groupings but have been dismissed or have not been admitted. In cases where one finds hostile comment about today's Sufism, it is always fruitful to check whether the opposition stems from one or other of such sources. The nature and action of contemporary Sufism includes the literary and experiential learning frame for its public projection and for some of its specific studies. The religious cult and esoteric school aspects, often in a very deteriorated form, are of course the most familiar sides of the recorded image of the Sufis. But this is only because, in the nature of things, these aspects have been more conspicuous and have received the greatest public support and hostility, and generated more attraction value. A study of the classical literature shows that the more dramatic, the more attention-attracting concomitants of Sufi, and perhaps other, schools, are only a small part of the whole. It is also widely known to Sufis, but not to others, that Sufism has not only a vast constellation of methods, but also that its schools must adopt the working frame and the outward face, which correspond with the nature and state of the culture in which they are operating. This not only accounts for the many, baffling of course, shapes of Sufism throughout the ages, but also for the current true Sufi dictum: we refuse to turn a perfectly good 20th century man into a second-class replica of a 12th century one. Idries Shah's reclaiming of this essential core of Sufi knowledge and versatility is one of the most classical things about him. Although many of the 1,500-odd tales, for example, which he has published, can be seen as therapeutic or other psychological encounters, psychotherapy is not the object nor the extent of Sufism. On the other hand, on the tail-wagging-the-dog thesis, the attraction of Sufism for those seeking mental stabilization is probably due only to the fact that such people are to be found everywhere, such is the nature of their malaise. The Sufis, and everyone else, get their share of them. They will tend, however, to capture any merely mimetic grouping and will in fact turn it into a personality cult or social or would-be therapeutic operation. The distinction which is made by us today between social and Sufic groups is one of the greatest possible importance in understanding both types, the false in order to avoid it, the Sufic in order to profit from it. It is still regarded as a revolutionary concept, in spite of much modern sociological research and illustration of the fact, when we say that people connected with human groups, irrespective of their overt objectives, may be 1. Mainly seeking attention, or 2. responding to herd instincts, the price of which is to adopt the apparent aims of the group. Simple though this contention sounds, all important ones do seem simple, it seems, it is probably revolutionizing contemporary thought in its working as an analyzer of human systems. As an analytical tool, one psychologist working in sociology recently remarked on this subject, this concept ranks for us today with the discovery that there was a chemistry lurking behind alchemy, making modern science possible. Sufism's further contention that emotionality and spirituality are not and cannot be the same thing is also widely seen as the reintroduction of an almost forgotten principle of metaphysics, once very widely applied in the thought of the Middle East. Its loss, due to the popularizing of spiritual exercises, so-called, broke down the barriers between effective practice and wishful thinking, which had the same sort of effect as would be caused if, for instance, printing compositors were to start to believe that, since all letters were indeed only letters, one could be used instead of another. It might amuse them, says a major contemporary thinker, but what happens to the message? Sufism is the simplest and most difficult thing in the world. It is the simplest because of its doctrine, which we may summarize: man is cut off from perception of his real potential and of objective reality, because he is full of subjective imaginings and conditioning. It is most difficult because one of the consequences of the above situation is that man is almost unable, by himself, to overcome it, no matter how he tries. The secondary personality holds him in its thrall. Methods have been devised, or rather devise themselves, and are used by those who know which one will work and when. These people are sometimes known as teachers because they have the overview which the others, known sometimes as the students, lack. Sufi study is never repetitious, never mechanical, because of the perception of the teacher as to what procedure will answer best in which case or cases. Mechanical systems differ from Sufism in this: they do not take account of the fact that the subjectivity of man will defeat any mechanical system. If you repeat "I am mechanical" enough times, this repetition will automatize you, however sublime the intent. Besides, to treat everyone as if he or she were exactly the same as everyone else, in metaphysics as in anything else, is a sign of ignorance, not fairness, where it is not true. In order to approach and to reduce the effect of the human conditioning factor, the Sufi master observes his disciple and prescribes the behavior, studies, and activities which correspond with needs. A Sufi teacher would regard the clamor for standardized exercises or practices demanded by many would-be students and many so-called teachers as bordering on the insane. As we have often noted in practice, almost the only similarity to our Sufi way of doing things which we find in the majority of the self-styled Sufic groupings which have grown up by themselves is due to their having adopted our terminology. In no other way would any of us be able to recognize most of such social entities as spiritual, esoteric, or religious. Even as psychological undertakings, their only contribution could be to pretend to be spiritual. In the process, none would deny that they might achieve some therapeutic results, but that could be achieved more easily, and as Sufi activities there is no possibility of any yield. A Sufi is not someone who is studying or believes in Sufism. A Sufi, according to Sufic tradition, is the end product, the result of Sufi teaching. Sufi, used as it often is for a kind of seeker after truth, is a misuse of a technical term. Sufis again do not have leaders. Sufis are all equal by definition. A major difference between Sufi concepts and those of other persuasions which are allegedly in the same field is that the developed or realized man who emerges from Sufic study is of infinite variety. No two Sufis are alike in any way which can be measured by the non-Sufi. Those who carry out conventionalized exercises are known as dervishes, roughly equivalent to monkish seekers. For them, liturgy, say, may appear important. At the Sufi stage, it is not. Most Sufis go through this dervish stage, but they have to graduate beyond this, as many classical masters have frequently declared. Another thing which has not been revealed loudly enough until recently by genuine Sufis for the imitators to register is that Sufi studies may take almost any form. They are not confined to what people are likely to imagine they will be like. This concept, by the way, is so unfamiliar and yet beguiling that it is likely to be adopted by mimetics as soon as this report is published. So, if you are interested and meet anyone who claims to be following it, find out by discreet enquiries if he got the idea here or whether he knew about it before. And remember, if he merely adopts it from an article, he is no Sufi, since the principle is rooted in experience, not in words. The main problem with the projection of Sufi knowledge of general principles is undoubtedly great. A teaching which requires tremendous skill and great qualities as a result of infinite patience and colossal effort is unlikely to recommend itself to people who tend to believe that desire for truth is a good substitute for effort. The people of this latter type, we should honestly admit, are to be found very widely disseminated among those interested in esoteric matters as elsewhere. In these days it is not considered acceptable or even authentic to point out requirements for learning which happen to be inseparable from Sufi knowledge. As an illustration, we may note a passage in a book first published in 1961 where it refers to a Sufi teaching operation in Britain. At more than one point, the youth thought that his mentor was more than half mad. He took him for long walks, telling him that one day he might tell him something of value, but that he would have to have patience. How much patience did he have? Listening to the way in which he tested him, for patience, tact, moral probity, and sheer endurance, one felt that there could be few who would stand the pace, in Britain today, at any rate. Since we first decided to maintain the flow of information as to the contemporary existence of a conscious and legitimate source of Sufi teaching in the world, including the West, there has been a vast explosion of interest, both from the general public, from occultists, and from the learned world. Each has tended to try to employ this information in its own way. What would be of greater value would be if the phenomenon were used not to support smaller preconceptions, but in its own terms, as something perhaps worthy of more objective study. If there is one single thing worth saying for general information, it is this: Sufi activity is purposeful, well established, and not in any sense experimental. Attempting to employ parts of it for shallower purposes than its own will yield correspondingly disappointing results. If, in other words, it is used as a therapy, it will operate no better than any other subjective therapy, as with the placebo phenomenon. If it is used as a disguise for a power group or social system, it will provide those things, but no more efficiently than any other incorrectly used outward decoration. It will not operate as Sufism. But it cannot be denied that where there is genuine aspiration towards truth, and when this aspiration is directed towards the source of it, there must be a correspondingly effective result. Over the period from Idries Shah's first authoritative exposition, the Sufis, 1964, there has been, for the first time in the many centuries of Sufi research and publication, a clarification of what the Sufis have been doing and what they have not. This process has been immensely facilitated by the acceptance by scholars and others of our revelation that what were formerly known in the absence of explanation as sacrosanct systems of the Sufis are in fact only fossils. Fossils, however, which make it possible to trace valuable information for those who want to verify the elements which lie beyond them, the fact of Sufi activity. Two factors have helped in this process of separating the chemistry from the alchemy. The first has been the coming forward of Sufi experts from the East to present people in the West and elsewhere with a unified voice as to what constitutes Sufism, and that its authentic current voice is directed by Idries Shah. This has been necessary because people are accustomed to looking to a single institution as the central focus of any teaching or educational system. The second has been the work done by many experts and commentators, and the diffusion of the materials into general circulation. Taking the second point first, we have seen the sale of more than 1 million copies of Idries Shah's books in over 100 editions throughout the world. The critical acclaim and general public acceptance of the materials on various levels has been exceptionally strong. In the specialist field, there have been numerous reviews and articles in the Orientalist press, and a great deal of enthusiasm from the religious and scientific world. That the Sufi materials have been hailed by psychologists as blazing new trails, although they are some of the oldest trails in actuality, and by spiritual circles as profound documents of religious experience, which means that at last the message that such branches of exposition are extrapolations from a central body of objective knowledge has now penetrated into more circles than ever before. The following excerpts, reprints, and comments from all over the world indicate, if anything does, that Sufi studies have at last broken out of the narrow confines within which lesser minds have for centuries attempted to limit them. This does not mean that cultists will not continue to represent Sufi activity as a cult, or as exercises and emotional rituals. It does mean that such people will be less and less listened to, and the genuine activity will continue apace. What New Society has called the alternative modes of learning unfamiliar to the West are now on an entirely sound and effective footing. Reviews and comments on Sufi affairs from a variety of countries and media. Adil Askari, Sufi Studies East and West. Extract. It would have been a relatively easy task for Idries Shah to remain within the Eastern and devotional context of the traditional Islamic Sufi teaching role, surrounded by eager disciples and welding together the system's rich heritage in much the same way that Jalaluddin Rumi himself did in his own time. He preferred to concentrate upon the publication first of typical materials in his field, so that the world academic and informed lay public, in whatever discipline, could be made conversant with the relationship between ancient Sufi thought and the pressing concerns of today. Afghanistan News. Article on Idries Shah's The Sufis, emphasizing the importance of the book and its authenticity with a note on Shah's Afghan background. American Scholar, The Review article noting that scholars unfamiliar with Sufi materials finally accept them as valuable in their traditional fields. Arab World, Who's Who in the Family History and Publications of Idries Shah, under the name Shah, with affirmation of his mentorship of Sufi thought and documentation of his genealogy. Argentinische Tageblatt, report on Sufi Book Week, held in conjunction with UNESCO's World Book Year. Dervish Bashir M., Idries Shah, Program of Shah's grandfather in Sufi development, spread of viable ideas to the West through a new method, backwardness of Middle Eastern projection of traditional ideas compared to the formula pioneered by Shah, the many Eastern authorities who accept Shah's role and importance, from Egypt to Mecca and Syria to India. Guardian, the Consider the Elephant, review discussion of the Dermis probe, emphasizes strong support for Sufic materials from eminent critics and the increasing use of the books in anthropology, sociology, medieval studies, and work on Eastern literatures. Moreno, Arthur, A Mind That Has No Match, emphasizes the synthesis of Eastern and Western wisdom in a Sufi frame, which quotes a speeding up of learning capacity, where a 3-week course in business management produced results which beat people with 5 years' study, and similarly technology and science. New York Times Book Review, the Books by Idries Shah, extensive article on the books and their background and influence, refers to the use of the teaching story and its use among the Sufis. Observer, the Some Kind of Cake, review discussion of The Way of the Sufi, the pleasantries of the incredible Mullah Nasruddin, and reflections. Refers to the new information brought to bear on, for example, romance literature, the atmosphere of the literature and the schools of the Sufis in the West today, the role of the Nasruddin stories in learning, the inner effect of the sayings in reflections. Thompson, R.L., Psychology and Science from the Ancient East. In this scientific journal, the ancient and newer emphases of the Sufi activity are set side by side with a contemporary thought. The author asks, what is the origin of this material which can prefigure work which today needs sophisticated instrumentation to discern and test? He quotes research into the various traditional systems such as the I Ching, Zen, Yoga and Sufism, as concluding that of all these it is the Sufi metaphor and method which not only correspond with the new knowledge, but are perhaps even ahead of current scientific work. Times Literary Supplement, the Review of Thinkers of the East, on the Sufi contribution to human thought and learning. Their instructional methods, though contrary to canons unquestioned for centuries, are now seen to anticipate, if not to extrapolate, the conclusions suggested by modern psychological discoveries. Van Reenen, D. Idries Shah, article on Shah's television program One Pair of Eyes, on his life at home and ideas on various topics. Williams, Professor L. F. Rushbrook, Contribution on the Magic Monastery, notes that the book illustrates the manner in which Sufi practice, with its devastating criticism of purely academic learning and its continuing Socratic search for truth at any cost, exercises a powerful appeal to many thoughtful people in the West.